It's been major news in the UK. For anyone unfamiliar with the case, a British nurse called Lucy Letby has been found guilty for the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 7 others. The mainstream media have depicted this as a simple case. Away from the headlines, however, a number of highly qualified microbiologists, statisticians, clinicians and neonatologists have raised major reservations about the quality of the evidence that was put forward within the 4 walls of the criminal trial. Officially, Letby has been refused a retrial. Forthcoming is an inquiry led by Lady Justice Thirlwall. As I understand it, the official goal of this inquiry will be to understand how Letby was afforded the opportunity by management to go on a rogue killing spree. I believe critical to a productive inquiry is the genuine ascertainment of what exactly happened at the Countess of Chester Hospital. For instance, a theory about an air embolism was put forward by the prosecution as a method of murder for several of the babies.
It was as if someone had injected air into their circulation. With injection of air, unless someone sees you doing it, then you can't prove that anything.
So narrowing it in, the goal of the inquiry should be to conceive methods of safeguarding against nurses going on rogue sprees administering air to babies. The problem here is that it is doubtful that any babies were injected with air. Further to that, if the reason for the babies' deaths are attributed to something that is either doubtful or not true, then going forward the inquiry will fail to safeguard against future repeats of such outcomes. The reason that it is doubtful that any babies were injected with air is because the prosecution's theory of an air embolism cited a paper written by Shoo, who you can see here. Shoo has been quoted as saying that none of the rashes in the Letby case were characteristic of an air embolism. Considering that the Thirlwall inquiry has the power to summon a witness, I think it would be interesting to see if Dr. Lee is willing to repeat this under oath. Mike Hall is a clinician and former consultant paediatrician and neonatologist. He offered his services to the Letby legal defense team, but for some reason was not called. He has been quoted as saying when asked about the air embolism theory, quote, "Just because we don't have an explanation doesn't mean we're going to make one up." Another issue with the theory about air embolisms is that neither the coroner nor the pathologist responsible for the autopsy discussed the possibility of an air embolism, so if the prosecution theory is believed, there is an implication of negligence. However, doubts about the common narrative with this case are not restricted to doubt over Letby's use of air embolisms. Many from the field of statistics have questioned the statistical evidence that was used to implicate Letby.
What piqued my interest in the case recently was the chart that the prosecution used to show that Lucy was on shift at all the 17 baby collapses.
Norman Fenton is the Professor of Risk Information Management in the School of Electronic Engineering and Computer Science at Queen Mary University of London. So you can imagine he's very good at toggling with and manipulating statistical models to get a sense of risk.
Said you can create exactly such a table for every specific nurse by restricting deaths to babies who die when that specific nurse is on duty.
Fenton is referring to the chart which can be seen, which was referred to in the mainstream media and circulated on social media. This chart could in some ways be seen as giving rise to the myth that Letby was there for every negative incident that took place on the ward.
And this is data which actually was got from a Freedom of Information request in England, and this is about Lucy Letby now.
This table, obtained by Richard Gill under the Freedom of Information Act, reveals that there were actually 17 early neonate and late neonate deaths during the time for which Letby was investigated and sentenced for. So there were actually 10 deaths, which would be hard to pin on her as she wasn't there. Richard Gill is a statistician with prior experience in cases involving serial killer nurses. Gill initially studied mathematics at Cambridge University and has a long academic career. Gill was previously an expert witness in the case of Lucia de Burke in Holland.
So she became a nurse, but then in a short time, she became Netherlands' worst ever female serial killer. In that year, there were 9 incidents. A number of them were deaths. They all occurred in her shifts.
Much like the case against Letby, the case against de Burke was partly informed by statistical analysis. Although the case against de Burke, it could be argued, was influenced by a more academic statistical analysis.
This would mean that 1 in 1,000 Dutch nurses per year would experience such extreme events. Well, there are quite a lot of Dutch nurses in the Netherlands.
A combination of doubt over the medical and statistical evidence used by the prosecution persuaded the Dutch Minister for Justice to reopen the case. Lucia de Burke has now been cleared in what is considered one of the worst miscarriages of justice in Dutch legal history. What is interesting about Richard Gill, whether you want to consider him a fool or a prophet, is that you can find TED Talks from him from 10 years ago where he is warning about repeats of the Lucia de Burke case.
The Lucia case was such a disaster, and nobody's investigated how it came about, and I think it can happen again tomorrow, possibly also in your wonderful country too.
Burkhard Schaefer is a law professor with a background in theory of science. He has been quoted as saying the Letby prosecution, quote, learned the wrong lessons from the previous miscarriages of justice, unquote, which I think refers to the table Norman Fenton was critical of earlier in the video.
Said you can create exactly such a table for every specific nurse by restricting deaths to babies who die when that specific nurse is on duty.
It's an objective fact that there wasn't much of an academic statistical analysis used by the Letby prosecution. Once again, however, concerns about the Letby case aren't restricted to experts in air embolisms or statistics. Some from the field of microbiology have raised questions about what actually transpired. David Livermore is a professor of medical microbiology at the University of East Anglia. He wrote an article in the Daily Sceptic titled "Lucy Letby Must Be Allowed to Appeal," which I will leave a link to in the description. In his article, Professor David Livermore says, quote, "The possible role of infection should be underscored. The Chester unit's sewage system, or that of the ward above, was defective, providing an obvious source of infection. That is why the hospital plumber, called as a defense witness, visited repeatedly. Contaminated water systems notoriously cause clusters of neonatal unit deaths. What outbreak investigation was done at the time? Any question mark? None question mark? Were sewage leaks the reason why the unit was later rebuilt?" End quote. Although not a specialist in microbiology, Dr. Scott McLachlan has a PhD in learning health systems. He has written several articles on Substack, which I will leave a link to in the description, which connect the evidence of the plumber to various possible infections. Referring back to Norman Fenton, he has done a statistical analysis, which I will leave a full link to in the description, where he has estimated there is a 177 to 1 chance that Lucy Letby is a killer.
Well, we've got the hypothesis, which is either that she was a serial killer or there was a sepsis cluster. Then we've got these 2 pieces of evidence, little evidence of malicious harm.
Remember, as per the prosecution witnesses, the air embolisms would have been very difficult to prove and were recorded as natural deaths at the time.
With injection of air, unless someone sees you doing it, then you can't prove that anything.
And then you've got the fact that there was quite a lot of evidence of a sepsis cluster.
As has been described here and elsewhere, the sanitation in the hospital was terrible.
And that the problem that you'd get that if it was a serial killer is quite unlikely, that's 1 in 10. Whereas it's very likely, a 99% chance you'd get it if there really was a sepsis cluster, which seems kind of like okay.
I think it's worth pointing out this statistical model mostly compares the likelihood of sewage leaks simultaneous with a serial killer. It does not take into account other factors. For instance, the mother of baby A had antiphospholipid syndrome, which is a risk factor. Some of the babies were preterm, and also some were twins and triplets, which are further risk factors.
And that actually gives you odds of about 176 to 1 in favour of the sepsis cluster.
The prosecution have described the use of insulin in this case as a smoking gun.
At last, one could find some kind of smoking gun. In other words, one could now show that someone was causing harm to babies.
The problem with the insulin evidence is that once again, several experts have cast doubt on the evidence. Alan Wayne Jones is a forensic toxicologist at Linköping University in Sweden, and he has said, quote, "Insulin is not an easy substance to analyze, and you would need to analyze this at a forensic laboratory, where the routines are much more stringent regarding chain of custody using modern forensic technology," end quote. Furthermore, Joseph Wolfsdorf, a professor at Harvard Medical School, has said there was probably something wrong with the insulin tests used in the Letby case because of irregularities with the baby's C-peptide level. So to bring this back to the Thirlwall inquiry, I think there's a lot of doubt as to what happened during the time frame when Letby is alleged to have committed these crimes. I think a productive inquiry would involve trying to genuinely figure out what actually happened. However, there is a chance things become less productive, as there is still finger-pointing being done by staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital. For instance, the hospital's neonatal unit head consultant, Stephen Breary, would claim on BBC Panorama that he said this to the head of nursing, Karen Rees.
I challenged her. I said, well, are you saying that you're making this decision against the wishes of 7 consultant paediatricians?
This would be denied by Karen Rees.
At no point did I say I would take responsibility for any further incidents on a neonatal unit. Why would I?
On a closing note, I will link to some sources I have used for this video in the description. It appears to me since the earliest days of the case there have been people speaking out, though they have obviously been drowned out by the pro-guilt crowd. As a final statement, I will quote David Livermore, who has said, quote, "No one who cares about justice should be comfortable with this case."